Day.
Right, Mr. Miss, we all get to go.
Yes, sir. You have trustees Daly and Teets on Zoom.
Perfect.
Can you hear us, trustees Daly and Teets?
Can. Hi there.
Yes, hi, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. So our board has been discussing, going home rule, what the possibilities of are that, for what it looks like, the process is, what it looked like for you guys, since we're very comparable and, demographics and size and kind of, those things there. And so that's why we wanted to follow this. We get a lot of questions from the board on, what it looks like cost wise, what it really does, to get you out of state control, things of that nature. And so that's why we called you guys here today. I believe you got forwarded an email question from the board. So if you guys wanted to touch on that, or I don't know how, who wants to be the point person?
Mr. Mayor, could we potentially do some introductions?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No worries.
We did all those in person. I was like, what am I doing?
But, you know, we stayed over here. And I stayed over here, so we were.
Yeah.
People are.
Or public online.
Okay, yeah, good to know.
There you go.
Good to know. Introductions, we will start with. If we allow, Moyer.
My name is Lowry Moyer. I'm a trustee for the town of Wellington.
Or Mayor Shosse.
How y'all doing? Brian Mason, Mayor Pro Tem.
Most of you know me, I'm Ed Cannon, former manager here, but also now a trustee. And very excited to have this discussion tonight. So it's home is something I've been wanting Wellington to do for 7 years.
Dave Wiegand, trustee. And Dan Myers, council person.
Matt Freeze, Mayor Severance.
Nick Wharton, town manager for Severance.
Lindsay Radcliffe Coons, deputy town manager.
Thank you, guys.
Got some more people.
Who are you guys?
Oh, yeah, who did?
I'm Ethan Moose, the town clerk.
Patty Garcia, the town administrator.
Dan Sapienza, the town attorney.
And then online, we have trustee Keats and trustee Daly.
Perfect.
Okay, circling back. Yeah, so if you want to open that up, Mayor.
Sure. Yeah. Might be best if I kind of start with our story, how we got to where we are today. And I had the pleasure of having lunch with your mayor and trustee Cannon to talk through this a little bit, which is kind of what got us here today. When Ed first approached me, he kind of asked the question of, in my opinion, what's the benefit of being a home rule charter in Colorado? And my candid response to him that day was, well, right now, what's coming out of the governor's office and the state legislature, there's not too much advantage to it. And I say that a little facetiously, but also accurately. The whole purpose behind home rule is to give municipalities the chance to rule at home, exactly the way it says. And the current temperature at the legislature and in our governor's office is to really gain more control, in my mind, over municipalities. And you've seen some of the bills that have come out. At one point, there was a proposed statewide land use code, for example. And going home rule and establishing and understanding what your own development procedures and codes are is really a good example of why you do it. In my mind, each community has the right under our state constitution to decide what it is we want to look like and how we want to act, you know, when we grow up, so to speak. I do believe that ultimately there's a lot of advantages to home rule. We'll get into some of those details. Our story, as it was told to me, because I wasn't the mayor at the time, the town board of trustees at the time received a presentation from CML as to why should you consider being home rule? And our board of trustees at the time, felt like it was worth their while to take it to the next step. And we can kind of talk about process a little bit as we talk about this story too. So home rule is designed to be citizen driven, not government driven. And so the first thing that you have to do is get permission from the voters to even consider it. Once you, and we did, we went to the voters, and whether they understood exactly. I remember getting the ballot in the mail. I was the chair of our planning commission at the time, but really had heard nothing about the home rule conversation, so it was all very new to me, kind of as a citizen. I kind of knew a little bit about home rule and thought this makes good sense. Whether everybody knew that or not, I don't know. But it passed overwhelmingly. Yes. Form a commission, explore the possibilities and bring back to the voters a proposed home rule charter. And so we did. So there was an election where the town was hoping to elect from the citizens, all of the commission members.
13.
There was 13 to be elected. And there were 5 people that ran to be a commissioner, and obviously they were all, was it 8 total? Okay. And Dan Myers was one of those that stepped up to run. And then, of course, they had to, the town board of trustees at the time then had to appoint the other members. And that's when I got a call from the mayor asking, hey, would you be willing to be a member of this commission? And I said, sure. And then ultimately that, my fellow commissioners elected me to be the chair. Great process. I've never learned so much in my life about municipal government. We had really good guidance. And we had a great group of 13, which really ultimately turned out to be 12. We had one person that didn't show up regularly. 12 very diverse individuals from very different perspectives. Thankfully, everybody was very respectful, made it very easy to run the meetings and keep things moving. And so we chose to, well, let me back up a half a notch. The first order of business as the appointed and elected commission was to decide whether or not you wanted town staff involved in the process. It's not required, it's up to the commission. We chose to include our town staff, and I'm glad we did. They participated, these two, as well as, I think our clerk was involved.
Sort of.
Our town attorney was
Our
there,
town attorney was.
and,
This all makes perfect sense because they know the ins and outs. of
Yeah.
this.
and then we chose to first, have them, be a part of it, was glad to do it. And I hope you're able to do that here, certainly your choice. But I would hate to see a community, and I would have hated for us to go into a situation to where the management and this commission is not on the same page as to what we're doing here. We were very fortunate that this was not a controversial scenario or a group of people with an axe to grind that says, hey, we're gonna form this charter so we can have more control over the town government. And it certainly wasn't, in my mind at least, council members trying to thrust more control and power on themselves. We were very fortunate that way. But it does need to be citizen driven, and you getting out ahead of this as you're doing, I think gives you ample time to start talking to people that might be interested in doing this. This is why we're thinking about it. Here's how you might contribute and so on. And it's when our process, after we decided to have staff involved, we also hired outside counsel that, which was probably the biggest expense of the whole thing. This was post kind of COVID, so half of the people attend online, and including the hired counsel, which saved the travel. And then half of us were there. And, once we put all those components together, then we kind of chose based on some advice of, here are some town charters that are relatively recent, that are similar size and makeup, very similar to what you guys are doing with us. And everybody kind of read through them, and I think we settled on Eagle, if I remember right. Eagle, Colorado seemed to fit the best. And we took their layout and literally went through word by word and adjusted and added and subtract to what fit us. And that worked out pretty well. I mean, you don't have to start like Thomas Jefferson writing the Constitution. You've got plenty of resources, including us, to look at and kind of help you carry the conversation. And there was never a dull moment. I mean, every one of the subjects inspired a lot of conversation. Well, I think it ought to be this way. No, it should be this way. As I think I told these guys at lunch when we got together, we had the mayor at the time was on the commission, and one sitting trustee was on the commission. I'd recommend that here too. You don't want to be overpowering, but they offered a perspective that none of us could relate to because we weren't heavily involved in the council. But it was one of those council members, just to give you an idea, when it came down to deciding on the voting, how old do you need to be to vote in the community? His idea was 30. He doesn't have, he said, I don't have any kids. And he said, from what I see, I don't trust our youth. I don't think that they are capable of making a decision, and I think you need to be 30 years old. Now, that's what you get into when you open things. And that, you know, there was a lot of arguments on the other side, and somebody said, well, how about 24? And then it was 21. We all kind of came down to, if you're old enough to die for your country, you ought to be old enough to vote. And so we stuck with the 18. But those are the kind of conversations you have. And as ridiculous as it sounds, it was good, healthy conversation to decide what is the appropriate age for people to vote in our community. And so I really enjoyed that part of it. And then just follow through the process. So you have, I believe it is 6 months, once the commission's formed, to present a proposed charter back to the citizens. And that is done through presenting that charter to the Board of Trustees and asking them to hold a special election. There was a big miscommunication or misunderstanding from the trustees at the time that they felt like they would get a chance to add their own edits to this. And they were very disappointed to figure out, no, you can't do that. And that comes back to the citizen-driven part. Now, that doesn't mean that council members or trustees can't be a part of the process. And I would encourage them, and I honestly think if they really knew that, there may have been more of them wanting to participate through the public comment section. And of course, who wouldn't want the opinion of the sitting trustees when you get down to certain issues? In our case, we had, I think, 0 public participation. Again, that could be
It was COVID.
It could be COVID. And there was no burning controversial item that typically draws people out to, you know, say, I want to stand up and be heard. So it was either that or they just thought we were all so damn wonderful that we need to come and visit.
That was it.
You know, I always like to think that, but maybe that's not.
I'm moving there.
Yes, right. And so we presented, we were ahead of schedule. I think we completed, we were meeting twice a month. And we were done in 3 to 4 months. We had budgeted, I think, originally $70,000. And we came in a little less than $40,000. So we were ahead of schedule and under budget. And again, the biggest expenses were the legal piece. And of course, we provided meals for everybody that showed up. We did a little bit of advertising as a town on the election itself. As it turns out, that advertising happened in a different fashion. Our mayor at the time abruptly resigned. In fact, it was the night that I was presenting the proposed charter to the Board of Trustees. He was not there, which I thought was really strange. And via executive session through an email, resigned. And so the council trustees at the time decided rather than appoint a new mayor, they would hold a special election. And so they tacked the new mayor's election onto the same special election they had already designated for the charter. So that in itself, with campaigning and so forth, that's where I got involved and decided to run for mayor. Helped bring people out to vote. And I think also caused them, not forced them, but caused them to help understand, what the charter was about.
Was that part of the cost too, as far as
I think it was.
getting it on the ballot?
Yeah,
Right.
about 12,000 was for the election.
Yeah, $12,000
$12,000.
for a special election. And so on September 7th, as I like to say, two great things happened in Severance. We became a home rule charter and I became the mayor. And so that's kind of how the process worked. And it was a landslide on the home rule charter piece. Really glad to see that. We did some outreach, but not a ton. I think we had one kind of town hall type meeting that was reasonably good attendance for us, disappointing in a general sense. There was maybe 15 or 20 people that came out and asked questions. The good news for most citizens is that not a lot changes on day one. There's not a tremendous amount of things that affect them, or at least in terms of how we, wrote our charter. But it was all, I think, very well received. Let me back up to the beginning real quick too. We had two very important presentations right off of the cuff. After we decided staff would be there, we'd have outside counsel. We heard from CIRSA, Sam White, and we heard from the general counsel from CML. Those were really our first two meetings. And both of them agreed and really encouraged us to keep the charter relatively general and not try to, as some people do with their trusts, where they're trying to manage from the grave. And if you spend so much time trying to manage what you anticipate might happen in the future, you lose sight of really what I think you're there for. And then the alternative, if your citizens are so inclined, of not getting into the weeds, is essentially giving your elected officials more power in terms of how to govern themselves. And we kind of sided in that direction. And I think, 3 years later now, or almost 3 years later, I still think we did the right thing. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. There's a few things that, having gone through it, might do a little bit differently, but I think 95 to 98% of it, we got right. At least so far. And then, of course, as you know, the charter can be changed. Takes a vote of the people to do that. We've had one instance where we went back to our voters and asked for a change. It was kind of a technical change that we didn't quite get some language right. There was no real opposition. It passed with no issues. And thankfully in our town, I grew up in Fort Collins, lived there for about 50 years. And I'll throw Fort Collins under the bus a little bit because I was there for a long time. Everything in Fort Collins is citizen driven, everything. There is a special interest group for every potential idea that you can imagine. And there's a lot of good in that. There's also a lot of bad in that. Thankfully, in our community right now, we're a young enough population that our citizens are busy making a living and raising their kids. And that doesn't mean that we don't beg for people to show up more and tell us what's on your mind. We want to do, we'd rather talk to you about it while we're doing it rather than have you come back and criticize, which you guys probably never have happen. And so, we don't have any people or groups right now that seem to have some kind of an axe to grind that says, hey, we're gonna, through a citizens initiative, we're gonna change the charter, and they have the right to do that. And you set the groundwork in your charter for how that's done. No different than recall, any one of us, the rules are set for how you recall things, and so, that's kind of the historical, picture. Dan, why don't you fill in any gaps and
Yeah, no,
then we can jump in on the questions.
I thought that was a very good introduction. I think the biggest and most difficult thing was the amount of material that we actually went through. It took, like I said, several weeks, twice a week, getting everybody together and getting everybody on the same page. Some issues that were just hanging out there were things like term limits. So that's one thing that we really had to spend a lot of time on because everybody had a different opinion on what the term limit should be. I think we came up with an excellent compromise on that, at least. That's one of the things I remember is coming out of that.
Yep.
There was a lot of, I know we did something as far as ethics, as far as the board is concerned. So we spent some time on that too, which was important, that it didn't have any teeth in it before. I think we added some teeth to that. So there were a lot of little things in there that we added to that would help our town to make it a better place to live, of course, and to give a little bit more control to council and or mayor. As far as the way it went very smoothly. There was really no major backlashes from everybody. Everybody got along, and I thought that was a very important part of it. Having staff and administration on board was vital, and having the legal assistance there, of course, was vital. So I think that's kind of where I am, and maybe the questions are.
Yeah, or Dick, Lindsay,
Nick,
from
Lindsay,
from
from
staff's
something
perspective,
else.
do you want to add anything or?
You did great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the outside counsel was really big because she had a lot of experience in, with some of the home rules.
Yeah, so we chose to go with outside counsel, not that our counsel at the time couldn't have handled it, but the outside counsel we chose, that's what they do. Their firm has done almost every home rule that has been in the last 10 to 15 years. And they were the ones that happened to do Eagle as well. So we were able to bounce those things, and she was able to give the board at the time how they were arguing about things and get that perspective. And it was a good process that we were able to get down to where staff, Lindsay and I would give all of our input, put all our red lines on each of the chapters. Then we send it to the both the attorneys. They put both of their opinions onto it, and then we would present that. And then once that was presented, we'd get our feedback, and that would get all changed. Then at the next meeting, we'd have another chapter where we were doing the same thing, and then we would go through and approve what was looked at the last one. So we were alternating it and keeping it going. It was a lot of work on staff. I'll be honest, probably for about 3 to 4 months, there was very little town management stuff I was working on because we were focusing on literally getting that home rule charter done. But the council understood because they wanted it, and the home rule charter. So much so that even the council took back some of their items on agendas, and we had a lot lighter agenda items for a while so that could be focused on. So it worked out well all the way around.
I would also bring up, having our town attorney as a part of it. Now that we have a different attorney, they maybe perceive how we had intended to write it. They maybe
Yes.
come up with things like, well, that's not how I read it. And so there's maybe some things like looking at it to be a little more clear on some of the items that we've come across, like real estate or other items.
Yeah.
We thought we were writing it one way, we all were on board, and then getting a new attorney in, we've had things that maybe we could clean up.
Agreed.
Would you like me to go through this list and we can answer it for you guys? The first question was, in general, why did Severance switch to home rule?
Kind of handled that. You want me to kind of give the background
Yep.
since it
Yeah,
was.
please.
So the biggest leading factor was we were at CML and there was a presentation on home. That's really what it came down to. And I started getting questions from council members and it was, why aren't we doing this and why aren't we taking it into our own control?
Mhm.
And that led to us bringing presentations into the council, which then literally led to, let's do this and see how it goes. That's really how it became.
I think the climate of the community and things that have been going on too, that we wanted our own constitution and we wanted to be able to control those things. So the
Yeah.
community wanted that too. So we had a lot of that support.
Yeah, it was definitely, it was backed by everything that was going through with COVID and things that we were having as our own town issues that council members were bringing up, and you could see that it was right at the tail end of that, and you had a council that was supportive of it, and then you still had a few citizens that were coming to our meetings that were very supportive of it to be able to give that full control. But it still came and was driven by the council.
The second question, did you have anything to add to that?
No, go ahead.
The second one was, does home rule provide more flexibility for municipalities in solving local problems? I mean, I can say that home rule gives us the flexibility to do that, so we can add things in there that the state doesn't have in there. That we'd have to have our citizens abide by via ordinance or resolution. So yes, it does give us more power to be able to do that.
It's one of the top 5 reasons is why you want to do it. That's,
Right.
it gives you the flexibility to really hone in again to kind of add your own character to ordinances and so forth. Yes,
And
sir.
you could take away.
Yeah.
From what the state says.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
You're still bound.
Sometimes, yeah. Big caveat.
Yes.
Yes, there's big caveat.
You're still bound to the state constitution.
Okay.
In fact.
So I have a question. That was actually one of my questions. Sorry, Sherelle Teets, trustee. So at the end of the day, because I have read a lot on what legislation is doing at higher ups to kind of restrict that ability to be able to rule your own home rule. We saw it with the affordable housing that was trying to be pushed through, as well as some of the legislation that you were talking about earlier. So my question would be is, as a town, what are we wanting to change that we currently can't in town at this time without an ordinance from us as trustees?
I think the biggest thing to always think about is the future. You don't know what's gonna come down from the state, and it puts your own control in the future. Although right now we have a governor that might be passing things as an emergency ordinance or at the health and safety of the state themselves, so it doesn't allow the town to be able to overrule that. You never know what next political factor is gonna be at the state and how they're gonna pass that. So that does give you the option in the future and trying to protect the town for future events.
Got it. So it sounds like possibly this might be a good thing to look at for next year after election cycles.
You never know. I mean, I never, so go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that, by doing it now or next year, that's certainly, up to you and to your citizens. I don't, in my mind right now, I can't think of any downside to doing it sooner than later. You're not inhibiting yourself any, in other words, you're not putting, handcuffs on yourself by becoming home rule. It may not, look effective until there's a new administration in the governor's office, but that doesn't hurt you between now and the time that potentially may happen.
We just
Got
we just had a situation with a law sent down by the state as far as weapons that are allowed inside of chambers of.
Yeah, that one's a little different because there was a caveat in that one that allowed us. to-
But that's the thing now, there was a caveat and they allowed us to do a variance. So was that for, and I'm asking this question, maybe I shouldn't be, but was that for every
Yes.
town to be able to do whether they were home rule or not?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted
So
to,
that one doesn't really use.
I just wanted to verify that, but it's something like that that's
Yeah.
sent down that you
If
can.
the
actually have
caveat wouldn't have
control.
been in there
Yeah,
as
right,
a
if
home
that
rule,
wasn't
Good
in there.
example.
we could have done something on our side.
Right,
Because
right.
of the way that
that's
was
the
passed, if
point
it
I was
wasn't the
making.
caveat, we could have still done something with that.
Yeah, and maybe just add to, Councilmember Meyer's point, trustee, Teets, just for your understanding, most of the legislation that comes out of the General Assembly explicitly calls out whether home rule municipalities can opt out of that legislation or not.
Yes.
So if you look at the individual bills that come out, you should be able to see that pretty clearly defined.
I think another part of it is what people don't realize, and when you look at Title 31 for a statutory town like Wellington, there's your powers and authorities and it's all laid out.
Correct.
Now, if it's not enumerated in Title 31, the perception is it's not authorized. So if Title 31 does not give you explicit authority to do certain things, then you can't do it. So that's where it ties your hands, whereas your home rule charter, you're not bound by that Title 31 restriction. You can write your own charter, and it needs to be general. It needs to be a little bit more, not very specific and outline point by point by point, but economic development is a great example, how you can start to work with the developers, incentives, a lot of things you can't do in Title 31 because you can't partner with businesses, but with the home rule charter, you can. So it can help encourage things like that. So it's not a matter of specifically laying out in the charter every exact power and authority you're gonna have. Now, there's a list that CML and the state and the Colorado Constitution says, it says your charter has to have this. Elections, term limits, those kind of things, how your vote's gonna be, when your vote is gonna be. Those things are laid out and you're given that, right off the bat, this is what you've got to discuss.
Yes.
So then it's just a matter of, okay, what fits best for Wellington or Severance?
Yeah.
And I'm very happy that you're happy with that process. It sounds like it was a great learning opportunity for
The process was fantastic.
you and Dan and also for your community.
It did,
Absolutely.
Yes. I mean, I wish that we had gotten more people right out there to, volunteer right away, rather than having to put 5 people on the board. But that's okay. It all worked out because the thing is we picked people from diverse parts of the town that weren't being represented by the ones that were elected. So in the end, it all worked out beautifully, I thought.
So I have a question sort of related to that, Dan. One of my things that I keep going back to is like, if we're looking at a timeline where we want to maybe do this in coordination with the November election, and start the process there, that doesn't leave a lot of time for community engagement or education or any of that. So when you brought up receiving your ballot in the mail and not having a great deal of knowledge about it, but some, I wrote down, well, how did that feel? Because my fears that we are eager to get this moving and, want to push it through and be able to hit the timelines that we need, but we don't spend the time up front for something that's supposed to be a very community-driven and transparent initiative to educate the community in the way that they deserve to be able to make an educated decision when it comes ballot time. So if you have anything.
The one thing I would say is just to keep the public informed of every move that you make. When you do that first meeting, send out the newsletter, send out the social media as to what you guys discussed in that first meeting. I mean, a lot of our first meeting, I think, was all your basic definitions, everything else. So that wasn't an issue.
So you're talking about your guys' first meeting after everything was actually there. We're talking about where we need to do the actual start of the election.
That
So
allows the authority.
That
to
allows the
appoint the
authority. So
committee.
we actually had to first, as staff and the current council at the time, we had to ask the council to go to the vote to start the process.
Right.
So that was, I think, what you're
Well,
trying to ask
I
for.
I think
Yeah.
it's both,
But
right?
that's right. I
It's
think-
hitting these timelines,
Right.
but also doing the due
Right.
diligence to be able to educate the
Get them
community.
educated so that they'll vote for it now. So in other words, like give them the
Or
reason.
not.
There's
but
the
have the
reasons,
information.
to be, either do you want to be a home rule town or not? And
Yeah.
what are the reasons why and why not? That would probably be your first presentation to the public.
Mhm.
And then you would go through what you did in your meetings.
So
But before that, Nick might.
I can kind of speak to the before part, because the before part, the council really just went, why not, let's try it. That's what they went, and they expected, not saying if it was the best or not, but the council at the time expected that the residents would educate themselves, and if they wanted it, they'd vote for it. And they voted yes for it, so then they turned it on to staff, okay, now start doing the process. It was really, let's just wing it out there and see how the community feels.
There.
That first
Not saying it's
election,
the best, but that's what they did. That was what the first.
No
one-
judgment here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with the second part, once it actually was approved, there was a lot more education that went on before that actual vote.
Mhm.
We did a social media campaign. It was almost like, we did it in-house, so I designed it almost like Home Rule for Dummies. It had the same background. I shared it. It has the same background. The frequently asked questions, and here's what it is. We posted it everywhere on social media. We got it out onto our newsletters. We had it at our annual event. We sped it up because we had our election in April to see if everybody wanted to do it, which gave us our summer events to be able to get it out there,
Mhm.
to then have the September special election. So that's something to consider. If you want to do two special elections, you can kind of control, or you can do, if you have a regular April election, you can have it in a regular April election.
Bless you.
And you can do a special election in September. That's what the council chose to do, was, okay, it was approved in April. We're gonna do a special election so we can make sure we hit the timelines, but also hit all of our events and get out there and educate as much as we can.
But that first ballot measure is the one that triggers all of the other
Yeah.
timelines. So if they don't have the
That-
education to make that first vote, regardless, we're tied, if they say yes, we're tied into now producing a
Absolutely.
charter and then
Correct.
moving
It's all
forward.
tied to that.
So
first one.
I think the education needs to come first,
Yes.
So,
in my opinion.
so the action that Mayor Freeze was talking about, the action that we're talking about was, you have to ask the voters if they want to do that. And the form of that is an ordinance by the town
Mhm.
to put a charter commission election on a ballot, whether it's a special ballot or
Right.
or something like that. And it gives the opportunity then for people to fill out a petition. And then there's the date, there's the election, you elect the charter commission. Now, if they don't pass that maneuver, that ordinance at the election, if they don't vote for them, then it goes away.
it
But
goes away.
Right.
but
well,
once
I
you write,
understand
once you
that.
do once you do the ordinance. It's
You're looking at education
gonna happen.
ordinance.
It's gonna happen. And then 6 months later, they've got to
I can't
present
hear
that.
people.
Then 6 months later, you've got to present that charter back to the voters for them to vote to approve it.
I totally get all of that, all of the timelines. I think what you just asked me is education before ordinance. And I think, yes, that's that's what I'm trying to say is if that is the one thing that triggers everything else,
Mhm.
and you're saying it does, then for me, and we can say people can look it up all they want, but I feel like we have a responsibility as officials to educate them or as a town to communicate to them what's coming and what this is all about. We can take for granted that they will or will not look it up. I think from past experience and history, we can't guarantee that. And for something as large as switching the form of our government, I think education, as much as we can provide, is important.
I agree.
And I think the timing piece, I know a lot of our timing related to when our election cycle was. The trustees at the time did choose to have a special election in September to vote for the actual charter. Timing that otherwise to where it would have fell on a normal election cycle might have saved some money. That's something to consider. But the first election that you have, I think the key thing to educate your citizens is that by voting yes to form the commission doesn't obligate us to do anything. In fact, there's no obligation to even spend money. So it's at least let's explore this. So let's back up in our process and give you a hypothetical. It's very possible that the community says, yep, you can form your commission and explore presenting a charter. If after 3 meetings, we came to the conclusion that we can't agree on anything, we wouldn't have presented a charter. We wouldn't have spent much money. We would have went back to the voters and said, we need to start over, we're not ready. And so my point in saying that is that first step can seem like a big one, but it's really not obligating you to anything other than let's explore what the possibilities are. Then once you get that go ahead, then you can start the general education process of here's what a charter does. Up until the point you actually have a proposed charter, and then you want to start explaining, here's the components. I don't know if that helps at all or not.
Well,
There's no guarantee you're gonna come up with a charter.
It
I
just
mean,
seems-
You're not required to once the vote has.
If you can't agree as a commission,
Then you can just.
there's nothing there forcing the commission to do anything. It just, it dies. Now, once you have a proposed charter, as we did, and assuming you get there, the citizens may reject it. And if they do, then you've got 6 months to propose a new charter that they either say yes or no to. If it fails the second time, it's done. You gotta start all over again with an initiative that we want to try to form a new commission. I don't know if that's happened. I don't know that we ever talked about that. If there's actually municipalities that have gotten down the path and figured out we're not going anywhere with this. It certainly could happen.
I think there's one municipality that did that.
Yeah.
The charter failed.
I know there's been one that's failed and it passed the second time, but I don't think it's ever not passed.
Yeah.
But to set up the commission itself and to go out to the voters to do that, it seemed fairly easy. I mean, when you talk to the people saying, listen, do you want the state to control what we have to do, or do you want us to have more control? That seems to be a no-brainer for 99% of the people.
For our people.
For our people
Yeah.
at least, because the thing is, we says, okay, well, we're not Denver, we're Severance, we're a farm community here. So our laws and our rules should probably be a little different than what they supply us in Denver. And we sold it kind of that way, and I think it went over really well. And you guys are in the same situation, right? Yeah.
And back to your question, you said you wrote down, how did that make you feel? I was okay with it because I knew what a charter was coming from Fort Collins, so I might have been. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but maybe a little more educated on municipal government than the average Joe. My recollection at the time during all that happening, and COVID, I don't think it helped us much in this process, and we got through it. Hopefully, there's not another COVID that we go through that you guys would have to do that, but I think I like the way home rule is titled. It says exactly what it means. And I think that's what Dan was talking about too, is people realize that, hey, this is an opportunity for us to decide. I don't discount ever educating the public. Most of the gray hair that they currently have, which I've only gotten in the last 3 years now, is trying to figure out how to effectively communicate with our citizens. Here's what's going on. Can you give us your opinion? And I've since learned that I will never quit trying to educate, but I'm kind of counseling myself to be less disappointed every time I find that there's just resistance to be educated. And to a certain extent, and I've heard it from people, that's what we elect you guys for. We trust you, do what you think's right. Not everybody thinks or believes that. So I think it's a combination. I think you as a board need to move forward. Assuming you have the majority of what you think is best for your community. And then I think you can make a reasonable assumption that you're gonna do the best you can to educate your citizens. And they're either gonna get it or they aren't, or they don't want to. But as I was preparing to, to be here and was just kind of recollecting, reminiscing, if you will, about, the process and would we do anything different, and so forth. I have no regrets chairing the commission. I have no regrets with the charter that we proposed. We've used it dozens of times, referred to it in terms of how we govern ourselves. I can't find a downside. I've never had our attorney say, you can't do that because you really handcuffed yourself with that home rule charter thing. I've never heard the town manager say, well, we can't do that because of our charter. There are some wild wonky things we might want to do that we've governed ourselves. But I think that's the key of trying to write it as general as you can. And let the times change along with the political winds based on the makeup of your board or your council, which is in your charter. When you get to decide whether you want to be a council or remain a board of trustees, we chose to go council. Town of Windsor's, their home rule charter, they still consider themselves trustees. So there's another example. You get to decide how you're referred to. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you so much.
I can't discount education ever. But I think in our case, it was important to move forward and assume at the same time that we're gonna capture the people that we need to have the buy-in on this.
Sure. Thank you.
Do home rule municipalities in Colorado enjoy freedom from state interference? I think we kind of answered that a little bit, but if you want to expand on it,
Define interference.
right, we may throw something down. at
Hold a
you.
legislative session, okay, it's intended, as we've talked about, and Nick, you can chime in on this too, anybody. It's intended for more self-governance with the guys that the state is still the big brother, just like the federal government. I mean, you're obviously agreeing to the state constitution. You can't do anything that's against the United States Constitution. If you feel like that those constitutions are interference right now, you're still gonna have that interference as a home rule charter. But ultimately, I think, as Nick said very well, it's difficult to predict the future. And allowing yourself the flexibility tomorrow when you don't even know what that is, or the flexibility of your elected officials at that time to decide, I think is priceless. I think that's the best freedom you could give your citizens ever, is more opportunity to decide for yourselves how you want to conduct your affairs. So I don't know if that answers, but what's your?
I think that goes back to exactly why the council wanted to do it originally. I think for the first 5 years of my career in Severance, there could have been several times we could have, as a home rule town, actually changed something that the state put down, just because of the way the state was bringing things. Compared to, unfortunately, now the second 5 years, the state's been making it a mandate that you have to follow it. So it shows that cycle of the 10 years that I've been with Severance. There could have been a lot of good things we could have done. Unfortunately, now we're handcuffed, but we all know that's just like a cycle with politics.
You asked about the costs. I think we covered the costs of what it does to do this. We talked about the election process. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay, good. What were the commonly asked questions from residents? That's a good question.
See if I can find it. I gave you the list, but I don't,
Oh, yes.
it was on that
That's right.
flash drive.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it too. We ended up with 5 or 7 of those little things that I did with which were the commonly frequently asked questions. Let me see if I can find them.
For dummies, that thing,
Was
each
it
one was
under-
its own thing we addressed.
Open house,
That might be it.
home rule handout. Up there. Maybe.
If I can find it too.
Oh, you're looking, maybe jump to the next question.
Yeah. What are some key considerations in drafting a home rule charter? That's a good one. Yeah, that's also a good one.
Um,
I think diversity in a community is an important thing to have.
yeah,
Because especially if you got businesses, if you've got you've got industry, residents, of course, you want everybody represented, I think, at the table there. So I think that's an important thing.
one that I would say, as you're maybe thinking about additional, I think the biggest, consideration to get square in your head and to see if there is alignment with the commissioners boils down to who do you want to have the power? And we started, I think, with the premise, and we had some resistance, I'll talk about that in a second, but we started with the premise that we wanted the people to have the power. Now, the other way you can go is you can give your council or your board of trustees more power. You can give your mayor more power. You can give your management as much or as little power as you want. And so understanding, and I don't mean that word power in a bad sense, but it's true. It's, you know, who's got control? And I think we overemphasized, in retrospect, more power to the people, to the point that we may slow down our own process because we gave up the power of the council and gave it back to the people. And one example that comes to mind is council behavior and self-governance of that behavior. You are obligated under the state constitution, I believe it is, in your charter to adopt and renew, if you will, an ethics policy annually, I think it is. And in that ethics policy, you have an opportunity to govern yourselves. And we talked about this a lot. And we really talked about whether or not we wanted our council or trustees moving forward to have the ability to fire one another. That's a big one. Being mayor for 3 years now, man, I wish we had the ability to fire some people. And I say that facetiously. It would be real tempting if we had that power, to the point that we'd probably be canning each other all the time. And then you're into total,
Okay,
boy, I feel better now, but we're not able to get, anything done. And so ultimately, our ethics policy is a great guideline that really has very little teeth. Because the ultimate punishment for anybody is to be removed. And in our charter, the only people that can remove elected officials are the ones that put them there. And so it would take some kind of a citizens initiative to, for a recall. And so I think I think those are a very key factor, who has power, who has authority. And, but one of the things that I say that we got a little resistance on, that I mentioned, we had council member and the current mayor on that commission, and it was apparent early on that they were really pushing for more authority. And specifically, my recollection was more authority for the mayor and less authority for management. And I resisted that.
I resisted that also.
Vehemently. We hire a town manager to do the job. If the guy's not doing the job or the gal's not doing the job, you fire him and you get a new one.
We're not going underneath.
But we're not gonna go run the town. I don't have that skill set. I mean, I own my own business. I know how to manage people, but I don't know about public works and utilities and all those things. And so we decided early on that we were going to, as I described it, give our town management enough rope to hang themselves. You've got the authority to do it. If you abuse it, you're out.
That's right.
But we've got to put the trust in them to do it. And at the time, it's after, I should say, I was elected and started understanding, I'm not here to throw the previous mayor under the bus, but there were some real power issues there. To the point that I didn't realize I was walking into a relatively unhappy, afraid staff. You know, they afraid I'm gonna come in there and try to whack them on, on day one. And so we decided, and I think correctly so, even now being mayor for 3 years, I don't need any more authority. There may be a few things that having the experience now, I could understand how an elected official and management could work together and make things more efficient, rather than always having to go back to an official meeting, always having to get a majority vote to do basic things, not to go buy things or sell things, but to get the information quicker that allows the council then to make a good informative decision on whether we should buy or sell something, those types of procedural things. But that doesn't, change the makeup in my mind of, in our opinion, Nick is the CEO. The mayor, I mean, one of the funnest things that I get to do is an opportunity to speak to young kids, 8th graders and high school and 3rd graders. Well, you get into the 8th grade and they're old enough to kind of understand how things work. And I explained to them how town government works. And here's what the authority the mayor has. I have the same vote as council members. This is our CEO. He runs the show. Kid raises his hand. Well, what's the big deal about being mayor?
Yeah.
There really isn't. You get to run the meeting, and you get to provide leadership. You can set the tone. And that's the way we wrote our charter. And I've explained to people, you didn't elect a king, you elected a mayor. And then a process is with the council, and you may choose to do that, a little differently, obviously, but I stand behind that, even having the experience. Boy, I had no idea I was gonna run for mayor when I did the home rule charter, and I wouldn't change anything. I've got enough responsibility going through my mind. I don't need the ultimate responsibility of having more authority. But there are some things you can do procedurally, and the way we wrote our charter is we could go change our policy that perhaps allows me and the mayor pro tem and town management to do that information gathering. You can't pass ordinances, you can't spend money, but process-wise, you could speed things up to make us a little more efficient to get back to the ultimate deciding authority, which is the 7 of us combined, to move on. So we've got policy things that we can change. We don't have to go back and change the charter. That's a good example of not getting in the weeds. If you would have tried to contemplate and anticipate, and then you think about, well, I know what I would do as mayor, but what about the next guy or the next gal? Are they gonna think the same way that I do? And the answer to that is probably not. If the town's lucky, hopefully not.
For one good example,
Yeah.
the cab,
Yeah.
that was the date. You want to tell them about that?
Yeah, I mean, we gave ourselves the authority to, at the council's discretion, to appoint necessary boards and commissions. We have a tree board that's part of our Tree City USA obligation. And at the time, we had a planning commission, which is a requirement under the state constitution. And since then, we have created what we call a Citizens Advisory Board. 7 citizens that we are able to kind of wash things through to get their opinion before we try to take formal action on something. And we've actually changed their job description at least once since we formed it. And we have an opportunity for council members to offer petitions at a meeting. And any council member has the right to petition any discussion item for a work session. Does not take 3, doesn't take 2. If I say I want to talk about economic development, we get to talk about economic development. And so we've now changed that to where that petition first goes through our Citizens Advisory Board. And we try to get a gauge on whether there's any traction from the citizens on the idea. Hopefully the council member, if they come back and they unanimously didn't like the idea, they're not gonna waste the rest of council's time spending an hour and a half in a work session talking about it. On the other hand, if you present your idea and you've got 7 members that say this is a great idea, you get to start with that when you have your work session discussion. We've gone through the cab, we've got 7 citizens that said they're in agreement with us to, pretty hard for somebody to say, well, I don't want to talk about that. So being able to form those boards and commissions was a great example. Did you find your
I have a
questions?
question.
Yeah.
So there were 6 main questions. The first one was, how would changing to home rule affect me? The second one was, I have to load them. Are there other communities that are home rule? Third question we got asked the most was, why would Severance change to home rule now? Goes back to, we had a lot of people, why so quickly? Number 4, how does a home rule affect sales tax and use tax collection, which I know is one of the questions, so we can go over that later. Number 5, will my taxes be raised by the home rule charter? No. And then number 6, how would home rule affect land use and development? And I was just reading that, and it's actually kind of funny, because that was before the whole statewide land use thing came out, and the answer to it was, we get to control that, but they proved us wrong on that. The state being they.
So that's the public, as far as, what are some considerations in drafting a home rule charter? I think we talked a little bit about this before, and I'm reaching out to other towns and seeing what they've written. I mean, take ours and have a look, you know, I mean, I think it's well written and has a lot of things that are very similar to what you guys do here. Was there anything you wanted to?
I was just gonna say, as I was kind of preparing for this evening, I asked myself, so what's one thing you would do different? And it's doing what you guys are doing right now. We should have invited another town that had recently done this. We reviewed a lot of charters. I would do exactly what you're doing. I would have brought them in and asked them, hey, what's the good, bad, and ugly, you know, about this? And what can we do to improve and things of that nature? So you're already on the, you know, right step, and I would appreciate the opportunity to be here and happy to share. We're not the end all. There's others out there that you could, you know, get different perspectives from as well.
And I think from a staff side, that would have been really helpful, because from a staff side, I was super excited. It's not often as a town manager you get to go through and create home rule. So I did that. I reached out to every community. I had talked to other town managers that went through it, and looking back, that would have been a great thing. But what we're doing here is having that ability to have my council see what that was like.
What are the mandatory provisions that must be included in a municipal charter under Colorado law?
What if I had that listed?
That's a big list.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything that they do, you know, but, things we add to it. I mean, it's,
Yeah. And I don't recall
It would have been the,
thinking that there was something on there that I wish that wasn't. I mean, it's all pretty normal governmental stuff that they're gonna require you to make sure you dot your own I's and cross your own T's. I think a lot of it is to make sure that you protect yourself down the road too, that you're covering legal basis.
So term limits of responsibility were a big thing that we spent a lot of time on. I could tell you that much.
Okay.
So.
Should we just rattle off?
Yeah, you can. It's our table of contents.
Yeah, so here's the list of what you have to have.
Our table of contents was the bare minimum of what had to be included, and then we added stuff into each of those sections.
So elections, you have to decide. We chose, by the way, to go to a November election cycle rather than April, which under state statutory town, you have to have an April election. The thought process was that we wanted more participation in the election. And it was a way to save money because we could cabbage onto the county's ballot rather than just doing our own. But we also didn't want to get lost in the presidential cycle. So we did an off cycle in November for our elections, at least as it pertains to the mayor and council members. You have to talk about whether you want to be town council or board of trustees. What's your town administration appointed officials and town departments? You decide all that. Boards and commissions. So we established what boards that we had at the time and then gave ourselves the authority to eliminate those boards or to add new as we saw fit. How we handle ordinances, how they're read. This was a good one. We had an effort, I'll call it an effort, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but there was an obvious effort from the sitting mayor and existing trustee to speed up the process of getting ordinances completed. And, you know, I'm a small business guy. I like things to go fast. But as the chair, I said, you know, this is one time when I think government needs to be slow. So I had asked to put in the charter that there's a mandatory second reading of every ordinance. So you have to read it twice. If it doesn't pass the first time, it fails. If it passes the first time, you have a second reading. To give people an opportunity to digest, come in the second time, offer their opinion. What we decided on was that there are a lot of ordinances, you've probably experienced this, that really, it's governmental stuff. It's not speed limits and leash laws and things like that. There's a lot of things that the general public wouldn't ever comment on, a lot of the ordinances that you pass. So what we did was we gave, it's a mandatory one reading. But for any reason, any council member can request a second reading and you automatically have a second reading. So if somebody feels like this is going too fast, I don't have enough information, or it's just plain going too fast, I want to think about it more. You can just say I request a second reading and it automatically gets kicked to the next meeting. So there's an example.
Also, every ordinance is a public hearing. And so the council or the residents get a chance to comment on it. So the charter commission at the time didn't want to allow ordinances to be able to be on the consent calendar like resolutions. So they made it mandatory to do a public hearing on each one.
We talked about, there's mandatory to have rules around your municipal court. Rules around town finances and borrowing. We have to have an ordinance to borrow, correct? So that's a majority of council members for.
So the way it ended up being
Yeah.
for borrowing was, you as the council now have the ability, if it's an enterprise fund, we don't have to go to the voters.
Right.
They can do just a actual vote by the majority of the council. However, for anything outside of an enterprise fund, we do have to go for a vote for bonding.
Public utilities, franchises, and use of public property. Taxation. Rules regarding initiatives, referendums, and recalls. We set the bar pretty high on recalls. There was one, the same council member that wanted the voting age to be 30. wanted the ability for one citizen to initiate a recall. And it's like, okay, that's all you're gonna be dealing with. That is my recollection, how we talked about that. I think we settled on 25% of the registered voters in the most previous election was the benchmark for petitions needed to initiate a recall.
Which still isn't that difficult.
In our case, it'd be 4.
So there's two parts. So one, you couldn't initiate a recall until after 6 months of them being in office.
Right.
And then also the 25% of the current. 25% of the number of eligible electors of the town at the last proceeding of the regular election.
Yeah, 6-month thing was kind of interesting and unique. We really felt like you ought to give a person a chance, rather than just, we see it at the national level. We don't like the way the election happens. We're just gonna change the rules, recall. We really didn't want to, we haven't had a recall, knock on wood. Although some days it wouldn't bother me. The miscellaneous provision transition period.
Yeah, so you have to put a transition period at the very end. That was very particular for us because we were changing from April to November.
Yeah,
So it actually ended up extending every council member's term by a year and a half.
Yeah. So those are the mandatory things that you have to talk about. And then
Well,
you can add any.
Some of those items aren't, I mean, things like franchises aren't in the Constitution, but I think they're a good idea. That list includes a lot more than what you absolutely need to.
Okay,
Just so you know, but
Good.
those are all fantastic items to have in there. But
Yeah.
Per the Constitution, some of those were probably good ideas, but
Yeah.
not necessarily.
so hopefully that kind of gives you an idea.
How did residents provide input on the home rule charter? I actually just afterwards, mostly.
Well, each of our meetings were open to the public.
Meetings were open.
They were in town hall, they weren't promoted, they were posted just as they would be anywhere.
There wasn't a huge amount of participation. I'm first to admit that, of
No.
course, and a lot of these things there isn't, and it's the 10 or 13 that do the work, of the whole town. So, that's kind of the way it worked in that situation. Was there
I
any?
think all the community
discussion?
events, we had a specific tent
Sure.
set up with a big banner
Yeah,
and
we-
flyers to hand out, and a lot
Yeah.
of the council would walk around and hand out
Like the council's charter.
the charter and walk around and hand out
Yes, yes.
flyers and talk about it and arrange them.
So we did communicate with the people through different means like that too. The last one you have here is if you go home rule, can the state still collect sales use taxes? And what is the benefit of self-collecting?
Yes, they can, and yes, they should. That's my opinion as a town manager, though. You might have a different opinion.
With you.
So if you go home rule, we still have the state collect our tax. Yes, you can have the ability to then collect it in the future. Right now, I would have no want to do that because I would have to hire another probably 3 more staff. And I have no need to do that. The only thing that is a issue that we have, but I've been working with the state nonstop to make sure that we don't have as many issues. But the only issue we have is we're a month behind. So when I budget, I have to understand that I'm a month behind in my sales tax. I have to do forecasting for that when we're doing it. I have my finance director, I have a new finance director. I'm saying I right now because we have a new finance director, so it's a lot of me doing that right now and teaching him how that works. And getting him to work with the state, but one of the things when I took over with working with the state was making sure that our boundaries are correct. Sitting down with them, making sure that we're getting the correct GIS. And we weren't. We got a huge increase once we started having the Amazon and we sat down there and at the time we had a really great finance director that came on maybe a year and a half after home rule charter, a year after charter.
March.
Right there, so right in that time. And between the two of us, once I got her up to speed, did nothing but bug the state the whole time. So right now, I would have no want to deal with that. However, in the future, yes, as the town grows and we start to get more commercial, it's gonna be very beneficial to be able to collect our own and be able to monitor that own. Because the process to be able to audit a sales tax person right now is a freaking nightmare. And we're going through it right now to try to audit to make sure that they're actually paying their taxes and working with the state, they can only tell you so much. Well, we'll go look into it. We'll let you know what you figure out. You wait 6 months. So there are the benefits of having, definitely, if you're at that point where you're collecting that sales tax or you're growing with that, yes, bring it in-house. You're gonna be able to ensure that your community is getting the taxes that they're due.
Can I just ask, would it cost us for the state to do it?
It's nothing. That's why we do it. That's why we have the state do it right now.
I just.
It's free.
know that, right.
It's just, you're always a month behind, and there are those particulars if you're not in contact and don't have a great relationship with them.
And if you get your money right away, you can invest it right away. I mean, that's
Yes.
something that I found when I was in Windsor was, yes, the state can collect it. Yes, they're gonna keep it for a month
Right,
and invest it on their own.
right,
Yes,
When actually it's our money.
right.
And we should be bringing it in and being able to invest it right away.
Yeah.
That's one of the
Yeah.
perks when the time comes.
exactly. If you get to that step where, and we'll be there at some point, when our sales tax takes over, we keep going back and forth every year where our property tax is higher and our sales
Yeah.
tax is higher, and we're at that level where it's not quite there. But when we see that sales tax come up, that is something I will go to council, because we'll have that extra month, which might be enough interest to be able to pay for those 2 employees. You never know. It depends on what that sales tax is. But
So that was all the questions that you
Yeah.
guys had.
Other
We're
follow-up
happy to
questions or
take any
what
more.
did we miss?
Follow up.
Give me a
With
minute.
Rebecca and-
Trustee Teets?
She dropped off, I think.
Okay.
I did have one question. It's probably fairly inconsequential. I see it sounded like you guys had 13 members for the commission. How did you come up with that number?
we're gonna talk about that because that was prior to
Yeah.
you being on there. They wanted the most input as possible.
Is the 13 including you guys too?
No.
That was an addition.
It was 13 residents and
12 active, right?
12 active, and then down to 11 after things happened with the mayor, but he was involved for the most part of it, so, yeah,
Up until. the point
Yeah,
when
to
we
the end.
submitted, yeah.
sure. So it was really 12, and we did have the right to go back and ask for another to be appointed, but the charter commission said, no, let's just keep it as 12. But at the time, the council wanted to try to get as much representation from each part of town as possible, although they couldn't choose it. We knew to a point that probably only half the people would actually go and try to go through the election, because it's scary to go through election. We know not everybody wants to participate, so to get 13 people on that initial ballots to come up and say, yeah, I want to be on it, we didn't, we had 8, and then they tried to appoint 5 that would fit other parts of town, so we would get that whole verse of what the opinions would be.
Sure.
And is it the minimum, is the minimum 9 and maximum 13 or?
Maximum's 21, right?
Maximum's 21,
I
that's.
think the minimum's 7.
is it 7?
I thought.
Yeah, I think it's minimum 7, and you can't go above 21, I know
Okay,
that.
so
We
you
had
feel
that,
like-
we had that discussion at 21, and everybody was like, too much.
Too many,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it came down to that, we were between 9 and 13.
Okay.
And they went back and forth, and I think finally, I can't remember exactly, I think one of the council members just finally went 13, and they all just went, okay. And that's what it ended up being.
And in the process, trying to. We had a lot of debate back and forth, a lot of agreement and disagreement. When we finally came to resolution. And then we would vote on the final language. There was very occasional anybody dissented.
Yep, very true.
A lot of back and forth, but it seemed like once we had the debate. Everybody was good with moving forward. I think there might have been 1 or 2 issues where maybe 1 or 2 people voted no. And my point in saying that is we never got to the point to where having. An even number where anything failed because it was 6 to 6. It just seemed like we were able to work through it.
Yeah.
And the people that had the crazy ideas about being 30 to vote, after hearing everybody talk, realized, no, this doesn't have any traction. And I think that's a perfect process,
Sure.
when that happens.
On that same note, depending on when you decide to do it, we knew it was gonna be over summer. So having 13, at least you knew you were gonna have a quorum, because there were times where we had people that did take their summer vacation, so it'd be short, 1 or 2. And it still gave a nice number to be able to have participation.
The question.
Yeah.
initially you vote to see if you even want to do it. At that time, do you vote for the people that's gonna be on the board
Yes.
also?
That is what goes together at the same
So
time.
we have to do both then.
Yep, so you put out the question, do you want to do it? And you put out who wants to be
Who wants
elected.
to be.
It's just like an election, yeah.
Okay.
Trustee Daly?
I don't have any questions. Thank you so much. Sorry, I had a hard time. There's a bunch of menu options up, finding my mute.
I don't have any further questions. Again,
I just want to say thank you for coming out. I know that's a big process to go through that. And it seems obvious to me that having gone through the process, you're all very pleased with. And you're all very pleased with the process, you're all very pleased with the result, with the charter. Sounds like your community is. I mean, they didn't wake up one day and say, oh my gosh, we got a new form of government. No, they just got up the next day and just did their thing. You're still passing ordinances, you're still doing the job, you're still providing that vision for the community. You know, it's just a matter of a little bit more flexibility than you might have statutory town. So.
Yeah, and
congratulations.
the other, I remember some of the advice from the, legal counsel and from, Sursa and CML. In order to have that outcome, you don't make big chunk changes that are gonna dramatically change people's lives. But you give yourself the ability to add those with the vote of the people, and you get to kind of baby step it, and that was the term I remember. You're gonna take baby steps, so part of the reason that I think we've realized the success is that we didn't dramatically change how people's lives would be. We did institute term limits. We struggled back and forth within a small town. You know, you can have term limits, but then you may not have enough people that are wanting to do this, so you get somebody that's good and interested and willing to participate, you hate to just kick them out for the sake of term limits. I'm a big believer in term limits, but you've got to have people that are willing to function. So, you know, we settled on 2 consecutive 4-year terms. And then you either need to change jobs, you can go from council to mayor or mayor to council and continue if you get elected. Or you gotta take a break 1 cycle, and then you can run again. And it's a way to encourage new blood, and yet at the same time, if you've got somebody that's really enjoying this and they take a 2-year break and then they want to come back, they've got the ability to do that. That seems to work, pretty well for us. We didn't have any objection from the community. The other thing that was brought up that I remember had a lot of discussion too was, as it relates to election, was whether or not we should have voting districts. And we came down to the same, no, we don't want 7 members from the same neighborhood. But at the same time, we can't force somebody from a neighborhood or an area of town. So we wanted to make sure that we had enough people running. And, as it turns out, I think our council is very well diversified geographically. We've got one neighborhood that I think there's 2 council members from the same neighborhood. Dan and Nick live in the same neighborhood. He doesn't get to vote, but
One of our council members, Tad, lives in that
oh
neighborhood.
yeah, we just appointed a new vacancy. He's from that. So you're gonna have that crowd. So, we kind of thought, well, districts is a good idea. I understand the purpose of it is to make sure that you're, equally represented. We are getting more and more people stepping up for board and commission vacancies. We had, 7, we had a vacancy on council. One of our longtime council members got promoted. She's got a young girl at home, so she resigned. We had 7 people step up for that position. The appointment immediately prior to that, we only had 1 person step up. And so we're seeing more people wanting to get engaged organically. So there's an example of, you don't have to force it, you know, in the charter. But we didn't restrict ourselves. We can change the charter at some point if all of a sudden it's my neighborhood is the only people stepping up to, you know, to run the show. And so, so we didn't do anything. We deliberately tried not to do anything controversial. If we would have passed the age 30 thing, there would have been people with torches. I probably would have been one of them, but, you know, just to kind of give you an example.
You would never expect something like that to come up. That's what's, it's just really strange that somebody would suggest that age or.
Right.
something like that.
I was like, man, how did you get elected?
Nobody over 65 can drive.
I got one last question.
Yeah,
Okay, it costs $40,000.
yes,
Okay, and that's just pretty much the cost of doing business to get this, to taking it from the state to home rule.
yes.
Correct? But is there any way that you're gonna be able to recoup some of that expense down the road by having it as a home rule? That makes sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
We can't raise taxes without a vote of the people. We could, I guess, come up with some kind of a home rule charter recoup fee if you wanted to.
Can we eliminate something from the state where it might be beneficial to the residents at that point?
No.
I don't
probably
think
not.
so.
Where you will make up on it in the long term is exactly where your town administrator was talking about the sales tax.
Sales tax.
Eventually, when you start to collect your own sales tax and interest on that, exactly what Patty was saying
So
about.
that would be a payback
That
down the
would
road.
be a payback. We could get a
Right.
whole nother.
Flexibility in economic development to where
Yes.
you increase
That's very true.
your
Okay,
tax
perfect.
base to
Yep.
help.
So
make-
there is a lot of ways to
There are
increase it.
Yep.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it isn't just a flat 40,000 and that's gone.
No, and
Right.
keep in mind, that was 4 years ago, and
Right.
so
Yes, it should be more.
it's gonna be more with the election, because you have a higher population than we did at that time.
Mhm.
Yeah, actually, we're about.
How did you sell it at cost to your residents?
So in our budget for the last several years,
Actually, that was the first year.
was that the first year we had that?
That was the first year.
There was a fund created, this was prior to my time, but I inherited it and we still have it, which is called the Council Discretionary Fund. And it's, I've got one council member that likes to call it the slush fund, and I said,
Stop that.
you gotta quit saying it. It's really more of kind of an emergency fund, and we've used it for a variety of different things, this being one of them.
Okay.
And so it was pre-budgeted, unanticipated money. Unanticipated mean that they didn't have a line item budget for, or a budget line item for the charter, but it came out of those, you know, pre-approved, council funds.
Mhm.
So that's how we did it at least.
And then
Go for it.
12,000 of that 40,000 was a special election though, correct?
It was.
It's a
Okay,
big chunk.
Right.
so it would have been
And we would
28,000.
we'll only have one special election if we work it right.
Well, I have a question about
Maybe.
that, because let's say you go home rule, you were lucky enough, you've only had one challenge to your charter. Right, one petition, does that then have to go to special election, cause each one, no,
No.
how does that work?
It's automatic that it goes to the next, general
Yeah,
election.
so whenever
Okay,
you
so
wanna
you're
make,
paying extra for each
No.
one.
Right,
whenever you wanna make a change to, so with, in our case, and not always, so to your point. If a resident initiative comes up, it could have caused a special election, but there are parameters in ours that say, depending on what it is, it can go to the just next general election, so that's something to keep in mind.
Well, yeah, that's, so
Make
that's
sure
where
you
it's
put that
going.
in there so
You
that
have to
it,
budget for those possibilities,
exactly,
right?
so we budget for every year for an election now,
Okay.
just in case. Because it will go to the next general election, which there's one every year.
Mhm.
So we do budget every year to make sure that there's there. When the council decided to change theirs, we waited to ours, because it doesn't have to immediately go to there, it could just be whenever we're having the next one.
so
Do you budget buffer for any petitions that might come up?
Every year I just budget for an election, because it can go to the next general one, so now we're in November, so if we have a initiative that comes in February, I can make sure it happens in November when our next one, I don't have to immediately have a special election. So every year we now have our own election in our budget, our own election, we call it division, I guess it would, with, it's budgeted there, we know probably it's not gonna be spent unless it's truly an election year. Yep, because there might be a recall election, you never know, so it's better just to have it there.
Yeah, and, trustee Wiegand, maybe what I would add to that is just in terms of, and I think the mayor hit the nail on the head here earlier, which is that, you know, some of the more interesting things coming out of the General Assembly, one of the things that comes to mind is, for me, is accessory dwelling units and parking requirements for these types of things. These, obviously, that's not a monetary tangible thing, but I would suggest that, you know, downtown Wellington, we really don't have the infrastructure for such a thing, right? So there's a lot of pros, you know, for us to have the ability to opt out of some of these things that are coming down from the state level and make our own rules.
That's exactly one that's on my plate right now. That will
So
probably
you
be
can't
coming.
opt out of that one, right?
There are certain things that I'm looking to make sure we can, and then I'll be going to council.
Okay.
My town attorney has not told me yet.
That's
so-
not gonna make us any income, but that's a good thing.
It's one of those, where, yeah, there's
Right.
obviously a tangible outcome there. It may not be monetary.
That's gonna be beneficial to the
Yeah.
community.
I mean, there are all kinds of other taxes we could start, like lodging taxes and
Yes,
those
lodging
types of
tax.
things that you could add to
Correct.
create and generate revenue that would help to offset the cost if
Okay.
there was one.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Or
us.
even one thing, I mean, I hate to say the word fee, but that's something that you can actually do without having to go to the voters to get their approval to do anything with the fund, so.
Statutorily, I think you can do that as well too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got one last quick question. They were saying as a statutory, we can only have April elections?
In Title 31, we can have a question on the ballot to move it to November. So
Okay.
that is one that we can do as a statutory.
Okay.
Town.
I wanted to check on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you have the right to take.
We're on
it.
top of these things.
Yeah.
We got it.
Awesome. Well, I definitely appreciate each and
Yeah,
every one of you for showing. up.
Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
We gotta work as a team, we're all little towns, we got. we got a lot on our
We're
plates,
here
for
if you
sure.
need us.
We appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Everybody.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you, sir. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, again, like this.
Yes, do that.
Now we don't.